Progressing well is used to report progress when a student is currently achieving levels 2 to 3, based on the teacher's professional judgment and knowledge of the individual child. In this instance, the teacher's comment would address the fact that evidence indicates that student is meeting or will meet the provincial standard, or the student demonstrates ongoing, consistent improvement towards meeting the provincial standard by the end of the term or year. Progressing with difficulty is used to report progress when a student is currently achieving levels 1 and 2, also including I and R designations, based on the teacher's professional judgment and knowledge of the individual child. In this situation, the teacher's comment should inform parents that evidence indicates the student is not meeting the provincial standard and/or improvement is needed to meet the provincial standard at the end of the term or year. Ongoing communication with parents is key if a student receives progressing with difficulty. Parents should be informed about progressing with difficulty prior to receiving the progress report card. Progressing very well is used to report progress when a student is currently achieving levels 3 and above, based on the teacher's professional judgment and knowledge of the individual child. The teacher's comment would likely refer to the fact that the student demonstrates ongoing, consistent improvement towards meeting or exceeding the provincial standard by the end of the term or year. This would mean there would be very consistent evidence that that student is meeting or will meet, or is exceeding or will exceed the provincial standard. Growing success defines professional judgment as judgment that is informed by professional knowledge of curriculum expectations, context, evidence of learning, methods of instruction and assessment, and the criteria and standards that indicate success in student learning. This slide tells the story of Jack and Jill, both students in Mrs. Smith's class. It illustrates how the teacher's professional judgment and knowledge of the child play an important role in making a determination of progress that aligns with the evidence. Mrs. Smith has closely monitored her students' progress in social studies to determine their strengths and areas for improvement. She has documented their progress since the start of school by triangulating evidence obtained through conversations, observations, and products. She understands triangulation will ensure her assessment of Jack's progress is reliable and valid, so she feels prepared to complete the progress reports for her students. In the progress reports, she will select between progressing very well, progressing well, and progressing with difficulty to describe each student's progress. In order to complete Jack's progress report, Mrs. Smith starts with a review of the evidence that she has gathered for social studies. She notes Jack demonstrates the knowledge and skills most representative of a level 2 in much of his work. In other words, the evidence shows Jack is not meeting the provincial standard. The evidence also informs Mrs. Smith that the most recent evidence of Jack's progress has been inconsistent. He is not progressing steadily. In fact, he seems to be experiencing more difficulty of late. Mrs. Smith knows Jack will need to be supported with a number of personalized strategies to improve his learning in order to meet the provincial standard. She is doubtful whether Jack will reach the provincial standard next term. Based on the evidence of Jack's progress Mrs. Smith has gathered, her knowledge of Jack, and using her professional judgment, Mrs. Smith indicates Jack is progressing with difficulty on his progress report. Mrs. Smith moves on to consider Jill's general progress. She starts with a review of the evidence she has gathered for social studies. Mrs. Smith notes that Jill demonstrates the knowledge and skills most representative of level 2 overall. In other words, the evidence shows Jill is not meeting the provincial standard. Most recent evidence, however, indicates Jill shows an improvement in several areas. Mrs. Smith understands that special consideration should be given to more recent evidence. The more recent evidence of Jill's learning demonstrates a more appropriate progress towards the achievement of the curriculum expectations. In fact, Mrs. Smith knows Jill will be supported with a smaller number of personalized strategies to improve her learning than she has needed previously. Mrs. Smith is confident that Jill's progress shows she will likely meet the provincial standard next term. Based on the evidence of Jill's progress, Mrs. Smith has gathered knowledge of Jill, and using her professional judgment, Mrs. Smith indicates Jill is progressing well on her progress report. At first glance, it might appear that both students were progressing with difficulty, as the overall nature of their work was at a level 2. However, Mrs. Smith was fully informed by the triangulated evidence of student progress. She also recognized most recent evidence should have special consideration or more weight in her decision-making. In light of this information, she appropriately used her professional judgment to determine each student's description of progress.